There's a particular kind of story that sneaks up on you like winter wind between Seoul's high-rises. You think you're signing up for another glossy, rich family, secret child, melodrama, and then, before you know it, you're staring at your own reflection in the screen, feeling your chest tighten because the real villain isn't a person at all, it's the quiet, everyday cruelty of being told you don't belong anywhere. And that's exactly what the 2026 series Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang weaponizes with almost unfair precision, turning a familiar premise into something that feels lived in, bruised, and weirdly triumphant, like a straight A report card earned under a flickering hallway light while your neighbors fight through the wall. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, with that said, let's talk about what this show actually is, because on paper it reads like a classic. Moon Soo-yeon, a brilliant but poor high school student, discovers she is the true heir to a massive Seoul conglomerate, only for the family, terrified of scandal, sunk deep into image maintenance, and emotionally allergic to accountability, to side with a fake heir who has been raised in the spotlight, and instead of getting a wish fulfillment fantasy where the hidden princess takes her throne, we get something far more cutting. Soo-yeon makes a choice that isn't flashy, isn't instantly satisfying, and isn't even guaranteed to work. She decides to win the only arena that has ever offered her a measurable form of dignity, which is education, and she aims not just to survive, but to rank #1 nationally and force her way into an elite university so undeniable that even money can't pretend it doesn't see her. And from that simple engine the series builds a slow-burning emotional machine that keeps asking one question in 100 different ways: what does it mean to deserve a life, and who gets to define that word? Released in 2026, Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang arrived in a landscape already crowded with school thrillers, chaebol dramas, and inspirational exam narratives, but it distinguishes itself by refusing to let any single genre take over. It's not a pure revenge drama, because the revenge here is mostly internal, measured in test sheets and self-control, and it's not a pure romance, because love in this show is less about butterflies and more about being witnessed when you're exhausted and still choosing to keep going. And it's not a pure family melodrama either, because it understands that sometimes the most devastating family betrayal doesn't come with screaming, it comes with polite smiles and legal documents, with someone calling you dear, while they quietly erase you. The premise is simple enough that you could pitch it in one breath, but the experience of watching it feels like walking through a long hallway of doors you didn't expect to open, because the writers are constantly reminding you that Soo-yeon's life didn't begin when she discovered her bloodline, it began long before that. In a cramped room, in the sound of a cheap fan rattling at night, in the humiliation of school fees, in the small calculations of whether to buy a workbook or dinner, and that background is not just decoration, it's the emotional foundation that makes every revelation feel less like destiny and more like an insult, like the universe playing a cruel joke. Oh, you were allowed luxury this whole time, but only if the right people had bothered to care. And right away, the show earns trust with how it introduces Soo-yeon, not as a saint, not as a superhuman robot of discipline, but as a kid who is painfully, frighteningly smart and also deeply tired, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. She has that practiced calm of someone who has learned that visible emotion costs money, costs opportunities, costs safety, and there's a scene early on, no major spoilers here, where she sits in a convenience store, counting coins, and the camera doesn't rush, it doesn't romanticize poverty with pretty lighting. It just stays with her as she decides what she can afford, and when she chooses the cheaper option she doesn't look proud or tragic, she just looks normal, and that normality is the punchline. This shouldn't be normal, but it is. The release year matters here because 2026 is a moment where audiences are hyper-aware of inequality, of nepotism, of the myth that talent alone is enough, and the series leans into that cultural anxiety without turning into a lecture. It dramatizes it through choices. The conglomerate side of the story, boardrooms, family dinners, press optics, could have easily become a glossy distraction, but the show keeps it sharp by making wealth feel like a different planet with different physics. In Soo-yeon's world, one mistake can end everything. In their world, mistakes are cleaned up by assistants, buried by lawyers, reframed by PR. So when the truth starts to surface, it doesn't feel like a magic key unlocking a better life, it feels like a grenade rolled under her desk while she's trying to study. And the biggest reason that lands is because the series gives equal narrative weight to the fake heir, which is where a lot of similar stories fail. They turn the imposter into a cartoon villain so you can enjoy the inevitable downfall. But here, the fake heir is written with enough humanity that you can't reduce her to a single label, and that complexity becomes one of the show's quietest knives. Without dumping spoilers, the fake heir, let's call her the one the family publicly recognizes, the girl who has lived in the mansion, attended the best academies, and learned how to smile for cameras, exists in a constant state of performance, and the show understands that performance can be a kind of prison, too, even if the prison is lined with marble. That doesn't absolve her choices, not even close, but it does make the conflict more psychologically honest. The system created her, trained her, rewarded her, and now everyone expects her to fight to keep what she has, because to lose it would mean admitting her entire life was conditional. The series does something really smart in how it positions these two young women. They are not simply enemies fighting over a throne, they are evidence of two different lies society tells girls. Soo-yeon is told, if you work hard enough, you can earn a place, while the fake heir is told, if you are perfect enough, you can keep your place, and both lies are designed to keep them exhausted, isolated, and grateful for crumbs. That's why the best moments in Pewaris Jenius aren't the loud confrontations, though yes, there are a few lines that will make you pause and rewind. They're the small, brutal, almost mundane humiliations. A teacher who assumes Soo-yeon cheated because the score is too high for someone like her, a classmate who treats scholarship students like charity cases, an adult who says the right words while refusing to do the right thing, and on the rich side, the kind of emotional neglect that comes with being raised as a brand rather than a child. The plot moves in a way that feels both propulsive and patient, because the show knows the real action is mental. Soo-yeon is fighting time, fatigue, hunger, anxiety, and the constant temptation to explode. When the family begins leaning toward the false narrative, protecting the fake heir, minimizing Soo-yeon, offering her quiet compensation or support, as if she's a problem to manage rather than a daughter to embrace, the show doesn't rush Soo-yeon into a revenge montage where she suddenly becomes a socialite assassin. Instead it doubles down on what she already is, student, a strategist, a survivor who has learned that the only thing that can't be taken from you easily is what you've built inside yourself. And that's where the genius of the storyline lives. The Born to Win in the title isn't about genetics or money, it's about a mind that refuses to surrender even when the world gives it every reason to. In spoiler-controlled terms, the central arc is Soo-yeon's push toward national top ranking and entry into an elite university, but it's not just study hard, get good grades. The series portrays the ecosystem around that goal, the Hagwon culture, the pressure cooker of standardized testing, the way adults gamble their children's futures like stocks, the social hierarchy inside classrooms that mimics corporate ladders, and how poverty turns every academic decision into a moral puzzle. There's a recurring motif of doors and thresholds, school gates, elevator doors in corporate towers, sliding doors of convenience stores, each one a quiet reminder that some people walk through life with doors opening automatically, while others have to push with both hands, sometimes even with their shoulder, and still get told they're too aggressive. The filmmaking helps sell this without drawing attention to itself. The camera language often frames Soo-yeon in tight compositions, boxed in by window frames, stairwells, stacks of books, while the conglomerate family is shot in wide, clean spaces that feel cold rather than freeing, its luxury as emptiness. The color palette tends to shift depending on which world we're in, warmer but harsher tones in Soo-yeon's neighborhood, the sickly fluorescent reality of late-night studying, and then these sterile, desaturated interiors for the rich family that make their mansion feel like a museum where affection is not allowed to touch the exhibits. And the sound design is sneaky good. The scratch of pencil on paper becomes as tense as a ticking clock, the muffled city noise outside her room becomes a kind of ocean she's trying not to drown in, and when the show finally gives you moments of silence, true silence, it's usually right after an emotional hit, like the world has briefly stopped to let her absorb the impact. Character-wise, Moon Soo-yeon is the kind of protagonist that could easily become too perfect in lesser hands, but the series avoids that trap by letting her be prickly. She isn't always polite. She doesn't always say the inspirational thing. Sometimes she's petty in her head. Sometimes she's stubborn in a way that hurts her. Sometimes she miscalculates. And the show lets those flaws stand, because they are not flaws that make her less worthy, they are proof she's human, proof she's a teenager carrying an adult-sized load. Her intelligence is not portrayed as magical intuition, it's portrayed as relentless work and pattern recognition and an ability to stay calm under pressure because she's had to. There are scenes where you can feel the cost of that calm, like when a teacher praises her composure, and you can see in her eyes that she would trade that composure for the luxury of falling apart in a safe place. The supporting cast is where the series really widens its emotional net, the friend who becomes a lifeline not by giving speeches but by showing up with small acts of care, the teacher who sees potential but is constrained by institutional politics, the rival student who begins as a bully but gradually reveals their own fear-driven motivations, the family members in the conglomerate who each represent a different kind of moral failure. And that's one of the most satisfying aspects of the writing. It doesn't pretend the family is a single villainous blob. There's the cold pragmatist who believes blood matters only if it can be monetized. There's the image-obsessed parent who thinks love is the same thing as providing. There's the coward who recognizes the truth but chooses silence because comfort is addictive. And there's often one figure, without spoiling exactly who becomes a complicated hinge character, someone who is not innocent but is also not unredeemable, and watching that person wrestle with guilt is one of the show's more mature threads. The fake heir, too, is handled with care. The series doesn't ask you to like her, but it does ask you to understand the cage she's in, and understanding is different from excusing. Her best scenes are the ones where her mask slips for half a second, where you see panic flash across her face not because she's about to lose money, but because she's about to lose identity. In a society that often ties a person's worth to status, being exposed isn't just a scandal, it's annihilation, and that fear drives choices that are ugly, believable, and, honestly, terrifying. Performance-wise, the show lives or dies on the actor playing Soo-yeon, and this is where Pewaris Jenius earns its cinematic reputation. The lead performance is all micro-expressions and restraint, the kind of acting where a small swallow or a glance away carries the weight of a monologue. When Soo-yeon is angry, she doesn't always shout, she becomes sharper, quieter, more precise, like a blade. When she's hurt, she often refuses to show it until she's alone, and then the show gives you these intimate moments, her leaning against a wall, her hands shaking for a second before she forces them still, that feel uncomfortably real. It's the portrayal of someone who has learned to ration emotion like food. The direction supports that with pacing choices that might surprise viewers expecting constant twists. There are episodes that spend a long time in the rhythm of studying, commuting, working part-time, and facing small humiliations, and instead of being boring, those sequences build tension because you start to feel what she feels, the pressure of time, the way every minute is accounted for, the way rest becomes suspicious because rest is time you can't afford. And when the show does drop major reveals, about her lineage, about the family's decisions, about how the fake heir was placed, it doesn't do it with soap opera music stings as much as it does with a kind of cold inevitability, like, of course the powerful chose convenience over truth, why would they do anything else? Cinematically, one of the strongest recurring visuals is the contrast between verticality and ground-level struggle. The conglomerate towers are shot like monoliths, reflective glass swallowing the sky, while Soo-yeon is often filmed walking uphill, up staircases, up steep neighborhood roads. It's not subtle, but it's effective. Her entire life is an incline. There's a particularly striking use of mirrors and reflections, too. Soo-yeon seeing herself in bus windows, the fake heir surrounded by mirrors in a dressing room, family members reflected in polished conference tables, suggesting that everyone in this story is looking at a version of themselves they are trying to control. The series also knows how to use public spaces as emotional battlegrounds, schools, exam halls, press events, family banquets. In these places, characters have to perform. They can't cry. They can't scream. They can't even breathe wrong. So the show builds suspense not from physical danger but from the danger of exposure. What if her scholarship status gets weaponized? What if her parentage leaks? What if someone photographs her in the wrong context? What if she loses her temper for 1 second and gives them a reason to label her ungrateful? That's the kind of tension that feels especially modern, because it mirrors how social media and reputation culture can trap people in permanent audition mode. And the title's promise, Born to Win, becomes increasingly ironic as you watch, because the show keeps asking, if you were truly born to win, why is winning so punishing? The themes are layered, but the biggest one is legitimacy. Who is considered legitimate, and why? Soo-yeon is legitimate by blood, yet treated as illegitimate by power. The fake heir is illegitimate by blood, yet made legitimate by narrative. And the series suggests that in a world run by institutions, legitimacy is not a fact, it's a story people agree to tell, and that story can be bought, managed, and enforced. Education becomes the one institution Soo-yeon believes might still respond to truth. Scores don't care who your father is, right? And the show both validates and critiques that belief. On one hand, yes, her excellence gives her leverage. On the other hand, the show doesn't ignore how even education can be gained through resources, tutors, networks, and mental bandwidth. Soo-yeon's victory, when it comes, never feels like a fair fight. It feels like someone winning a marathon while carrying a backpack full of stones. Another theme that sneaks in is the cost of being the good one. Soo-yeon is constantly pressured to be grateful, to be humble, to not cause trouble, as if her existence itself is a disruption. The rich family's moral calculus is always transactional. What is the cheapest way to make this problem go away? And the show's most devastating emotional beat isn't a betrayal with fireworks, it's the repeated experience of being offered half-love. We'll support your studies. We'll give you a stipend. We'll make sure you're comfortable. All of it carefully measured to avoid the one thing she actually needs, recognition. She doesn't want to be sponsored, she wants to be claimed. And because the family refuses that, the story becomes about self-claiming, about Soo-yeon building a life so solid that even if they never open the door, she can still create an exit. The pacing, which some viewers might call slow, in the middle stretch, is actually one of the reasons it hits so hard, because it replicates the real sensation of working toward a life-changing exam. Days blur together, progress is microscopic, motivation comes and goes, and your body becomes a machine you push past its limits. The show spends time on exhaustion, on sleep deprivation, on the way your brain starts to play tricks when you're too stressed, and it frames studying not as a cute montage but as a war of attrition. There are sequences where Soo-yeon's world narrows to paper, ink, and the sound of her own breathing, and by the time the series reaches its bigger set-piece moments, public rankings, university admission stakes, family power plays, you feel like you earned the tension alongside her. The emotional analysis here really comes down to how the show depicts resilience. A lot of dramas glamorize resilience as this shiny superpower, but Pewaris Jenius portrays resilience as something uglier and more honest. Resilience is sometimes just not dying. Resilience is showing up to school after being humiliated. Resilience is doing math problems while your stomach hurts. Resilience is biting your tongue in front of someone who owes you an apology because you can't afford the consequences of demanding it. And the series doesn't pretend that's healthy, it shows the toll. It shows how strength can become isolation, how being capable can make people feel entitled to load more weight onto your back. There's also an undercurrent of anger that the show treats as sacred rather than shameful. Soo-yeon's anger is not random, it's informed, it's intelligent, and it's often the only thing keeping her moving when hope feels like a luxury. The music underscores this with a score that alternates between minimal piano lines, almost like a metronome for studying, and swelling orchestral crescendos that arrive not when she gets something for free, but when she chooses herself. One of the most emotionally immersive aspects is how the show frames small victories. A passing score. A teacher's brief acknowledgement. A friend saving her a seat. A part-time job shift that pays just enough to buy a reference book. These moments are filmed like wins because for her they are wins. And that recalibrates the viewer's sense of what matters. Suddenly, the mansion drama feels almost irrelevant compared to whether Soo-yeon can keep her scholarship or whether she has a quiet place to study. That's not to say the conglomerate plotline is weak, far from it. It's actually a mirror, showing you how absurd wealth becomes when it's detached from human empathy. The family's obsession with appearances becomes a kind of horror. They will do anything to keep the public story intact, even if it means sacrificing the real person standing in front of them. And the show explores how power doesn't always need violence, it can simply deny. Deny meetings. Deny acknowledgement. Deny paperwork. Deny invitations. Deny a name. Denial is the weapon. In terms of character impressions, one of the most interesting dynamics is how Soo-yeon navigates relationships without letting them derail her. The show flirts with romance in a way that feels grounded. There's likely a character, a classmate, maybe someone adjacent to the wealthy world, who sees her not as a charity case or a threat but as an equal mind, and their chemistry is less about grand gestures and more about intellectual recognition and quiet support. The series is careful not to turn romance into rescue. Soo-yeon is not saved by love. If anything, love here is portrayed as a risk. Getting close to someone means giving them away to hurt you, and Soo-yeon has learned to live with her doors locked. So when she does allow tenderness, it's earned, and it feels like sunlight in a room you thought would always be dim. The show also does something meaningful with mentorship, but again, it avoids the cliché of a wise adult swooping in. Mentors here are flawed, sometimes complicit, sometimes scared, and the help they offer is limited. That limitation is the point. The system isn't built to save her, so any aid she receives is partial, conditional, messy. That makes Soo-yeon's eventual momentum feel like hers, not gifted. Cinematic highlights, without giving away key endgame twists, include the way exam sequences are filmed like heists. You get the night before tension, the rituals, the packed pencils, the quiet prayer-like moments, the early morning commute with thousands of other students moving like a single organism of anxiety. The series captures that specific Korean exam culture intensity where an entire country seems to hold its breath on one day, and even if you've never lived it, you feel it. And then, when the results come, the show understands that joy can be terrifying. For someone like Soo-yeon, success isn't just success, it's exposure. If she rises too high, people will look. The possibility of using her lineage as a weapon. And the tension becomes not just whether she will succeed, but what kind of person success will shape her into. That's where the title becomes a moral riddle. Being born to win could mean you were born with an advantage, but Soo-yeon's entire life contradicts that. So maybe it means something else. Maybe it means she was born with the kind of mind that can survive anything, the kind of will that refuses to accept a narrative imposed on it. But even that has a shadow side, because a will that strong can also become lonely. The show hints at this loneliness in subtle ways. Soo-yeon eating alone, walking home alone, carrying her achievements like stones in her pocket. Even when she has people around her, she often feels like she's on a separate track, because her stakes are different. For her classmates, a bad score is disappointing. For her, it can be catastrophic. That difference isolates her, and the show makes you feel that isolation. There's also a quiet commentary on how society romanticizes self-made success while ignoring the violence that produces it. People love an underdog, but they love the underdog most when the underdog is entertaining, when the underdog is inspirational, when the underdog's pain can be consumed like content. Pewaris Jenius critiques that by showing how adults and institutions sometimes exploit Soo-yeon's story. Her excellence becomes a spectacle. Her poverty becomes a narrative. And she has to fight not just to succeed, but to retain ownership of her own life. That's why the best emotional payoff in the series isn't tied to a mansion or a trust fund, it's tied to moments of self-definition. Moments where she says, in action if not always in words, I am not your problem to solve. I am not your secret to hide. I am not your charity case. I am not your scandal. I am a person. And when the show lets that land, it's catharsis. If you're wondering about the technical craft beyond performances, cinematography, production design, music, it's all working in harmony. The school environments feel authentic, worn desks, crowded hallways, the particular oppressive brightness of classroom lighting. The wealthy spaces feel curated, art that looks expensive but impersonal, rooms too big to be comforting. Costuming is used as storytelling, too. Soo-yeon's clothes are practical, repeated, slightly worn, not in a pitying way but in a realistic way, while the fake heirs' outfits are immaculate, each one a message. Over time, you start to notice how Soo-yeon's appearance changes not with wealth but with purpose, small shifts that show she's gaining control, not glamour. The score avoids melodrama most of the time, and when it swells, it's usually to honor effort rather than fate. Editing is clean, with enough breathing room to let scenes hurt. The series often ends episodes on emotional turning points rather than cliffhanger, which is a bold move, because it trusts you'll come back not for shock, but for feeling. And feeling is the currency here. By the time you're deep into it, you're not watching to see if the family gets exposed, you're watching to see if Soo-yeon gets peace, even for one night. Now let's talk about the spoiler-controlled story overview in a little more detail, because I know some of you want a clearer sense of what you're getting into without having the ending ruined. The early episodes establish Soo-yeon's life, her financial struggle, her academic brilliance, her social position at school, and the subtle ways institutions treat poverty as a moral failing. Then the inheritance thread enters, hints, documents, whispers, adults acting strange, a sense that her existence is inconvenient to powerful people. When the truth begins to surface, that she's tied by blood to this massive conglomerate, it doesn't immediately improve her life, instead it destabilizes it. Suddenly, her grades aren't just her grades. Suddenly, people have agendas. Suddenly, every relationship feels like it has an angle. The fake heir's world overlaps with hers, bringing tension into the school environment and the public narrative. The family reacts not like a family but like a corporation: risk assessment, damage control, strategic alliances. Soo-yeon, realizing that emotional appeals won't work on people who measure love in headlines, decides to pursue an academic path so dominant it becomes impossible to ignore. That pursuit brings her into competition with students who have resources she can't dream of, and it forces her into choices about pride, alliances, and what she's willing to sacrifice for her future. The series builds toward major exam milestones and university admission stakes, all while the family drama tightens like a noose, because the closer Soo-yeon gets to undeniable success, the more dangerous she becomes to the narrative the wealthy family is trying to preserve. That's the core. Everything else, romance, friendships, betrayals, spins around that engine. And the reason it works is because the series doesn't forget the emotional truth. Soo-yeon isn't chasing prestige because she's greedy, she's chasing safety. She's chasing the right to exist without asking permission. Character impressions, again, are strong because even minor characters often have a moment where they feel real. A convenience store owner who sees her studying and offers quiet kindness. A classmate who says something cruel without realizing the impact, then has to live with it. A teacher who wants to help but fears the administration. These small moments build a world where Soo-yeon's struggle isn't happening in a vacuum, it's happening in a society that constantly tests whether people can remain human inside systems designed to dehumanize. And that's why the emotional analysis keeps coming back to this: Pewaris Jenius is not a fantasy of instant justice. It's a portrayal of delayed justice, earned justice, sometimes incomplete justice. The show seems deeply aware that in real life, truth doesn't automatically win. People don't automatically apologize. Families don't automatically change. And yet, the series still finds a way to be inspiring without lying to you. It suggests that even if the world refuses to validate you, you can still build a self that is not negotiable. That idea is powerful, and it's delivered not through speeches but through repeated action. Soo-yeon sitting down to study again. Soo-yeon waking up again. Soo-yeon choosing not to break, even when breaking would be understandable. Themes of class, identity, meritocracy, and gender expectations run through everything. The show also touches on how women are pitted against each other, especially in elite spaces, and how that benefits the people in power. The rivalry between Soo-yeon and the fake heir is intense, but the series occasionally shows you the tragedy behind it: two girls fighting over legitimacy in a system that would happily discard both the moment they stop being useful. The conglomerate elders, the board members, the image managers, they are the true constant, because they don't care who wins as long as the machine keeps running. That's why the show's most chilling moments often involve adults speaking calmly about a teenager's life like it's a line item. It's dehumanization with perfect manners. In terms of cultural impact, the show's academic focus hits especially hard in places where exam culture is a shared trauma. If people look, they'll ask why. If they ask why, secrets spill. So every win is also a threat. That is such a powerful narrative engine, because it turns the inspirational climb into a thriller. Can she keep winning without triggering the wealthy world's immune system? Performances across the board support this tension. The actors playing the family members embody that polished cruelty where they can smile while cutting you. The fake heir's actor, again, speaking generally, brings a sharpness that prevents the character from becoming a caricature. You can see the calculation, yes, but you also see the fear underneath, the kind that makes a person do things they might not do if they felt safe. And the show's direction gives these characters space to breathe, allowing scenes to linger just long enough for you to catch subtext. There's a particular kind of scene Pewaris Jenius loves: two characters in a room, polite conversation on the surface, war underneath. The camera stays steady, the dialogue is measured, and the tension is all in what's not said. Those scenes are addictive because they make you lean in, like you're eavesdropping on something dangerous. In terms of writing, the dialogue often has this razor quality where a line can function as both an insult and a compliment depending on who's listening. "You're very hardworking" becomes, "You're not naturally meant to be here." "We're proud of you" becomes, "Don't embarrass us." And Soo-yeon's best lines aren't always the loudest clapbacks, sometimes they're quiet statements of fact that refuse to beg. The series respects her intelligence by letting her think. You see her planning, anticipating, choosing what battles to fight. That's another place where the show feels more mature than its premise suggests. It understands that poor people often become strategic not because they are manipulative, but because they have to be. When resources are scarce, you learn to predict outcomes. You learn to read moods. You learn to survive rooms. Pacing-wise, the show is confident enough to spend time on process, but it still delivers turning points at the right moments, revelations that reframe earlier scenes, public moments that force private truths to shift, and academic milestones that feel like season finales in miniature. If there's a criticism to make, it's that some viewers may feel the middle stretch dwells too long in repetition, another late night, another insult, another obstacle, but I'd argue that repetition is part of the thesis. The grind is repetitive. Poverty is repetitive. Trying to escape a class system is repetitive. The question is whether the show keeps finding new emotional angles inside that repetition, and for the most part it does, by escalating stakes and deepening relationships. The cultural impact is where Pewaris Jenius becomes more than entertainment. In 2026, audiences are hungry for stories that validate their exhaustion without selling them false hope, and this series threads that needle by being both cathartic and honest. Online, reactions tend to split into two camps: viewers who come for the chaebol secrets and stay for the academic underdog story, and viewers who come for the underdog story and find themselves unexpectedly invested in the moral rot of the family politics. Discussions often center around the show's depiction of education as both salvation and trap, and the way it portrays merit as something society praises publicly while undermining privately. You also see a lot of people resonating with Soo-yeon's refusal to perform gratitude. That is a big deal culturally because so many narratives about poor protagonists demand that they be endlessly humble and thankful. Soo-yeon is thankful when people are kind, but she does not thank people for basic decency, and she does not apologize for existing. That alone feels radical in a genre that often punishes women for anger. The series also sparks conversation about identity. If your family rejects you but your blood ties you to them, who are you? If your achievements are used by others to feel virtuous, who owns those achievements? If your name becomes a headline, do you still get to be a person? In terms of audience response, the show's most re-watched moments, based on the way people talk about it, aren't necessarily the big reveals, but the quiet scenes where Soo-yeon chooses herself, closing a door on a conversation that would degrade her, walking away from money that comes with humiliation, staying up to finish one more practice set because she refuses to let anyone else write her story. People quote her lines like mantras. Students post clips during exam season. Adults who've been through similar pressure comment about feeling seen. And that's the mark of a series that hits a nerve. It becomes a companion to real life. Visually, the show's imagery of Seoul as both dream and machine resonates too. You see the city as aspiration, towering universities, glittering districts, and as grinder, crowded buses, relentless schedules, the sense that the city is always moving and if you stop, you vanish. That duality gives Pewaris Jenius a slightly dystopian edge without ever leaving realism. It's not sci-fi, it's just modern life turned up one notch. The editing also deserves praise for how it handles parallel lives: Soo-yeon studying late at night intercut with the fake heir attending a gala, Soo-yeon working a job intercut with the family discussing her fate like a business decision, and those juxtapositions do the thematic work without anyone needing to explain it. The series trusts the viewer to feel the injustice. And then, because we're on bongo gaming, I want to talk about why this show is so bingeable even if you're not typically into school dramas. It has that level up satisfaction, the sense of progress, of skills accumulating, of obstacles being cleared, but it doesn't cheapen that satisfaction. Soo-yun's level-ups cost something. Every advancement comes with new enemies, new scrutiny, new exhaustion. It's like watching someone speedrun a game where the difficulty scales faster than your gear, and the only resource you can't farm is rest. That makes it tense in a way that's familiar to gamers. You're constantly calculating risk, constantly bracing for the next debuff, constantly hoping she finds a safe save point. And the show plays with that rhythm. It gives you small wins like checkpoint saves, then hits you with a boss fight disguised as a parent-teacher meeting or a scholarship review board. The emotional immersion comes from how personal those boss fights feel. They are not abstract. They are humiliations. They are moral tests. They are moments where she has to decide whether to compromise her dignity for a strategic advantage. And the series refuses to give easy answers. Sometimes compromise is necessary. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes she regrets her choices. Sometimes she doesn't. That ambiguity is what makes it feel adult. As we move toward the later part of the story, still keeping it spoiler-controlled, the series raises a question that becomes almost unbearable. What if Soo-yun wins academically, but loses herself? What if she enters the elite university, but the cost is emotional numbness? What if her revenge is just becoming another product of the same system that hurt her? The show plays with that fear by introducing temptations, the allure of finally having money, the seduction of power. But even outside that context, the emotional core translates. Anyone who has ever been underestimated, anyone who has ever been told they're not from here, anyone who has ever had to prove themselves twice as much for half the recognition, will find something painfully familiar in Soo-yun's journey. Viewers also tend to praise the series for not glamorizing wealth. The mansion is not a dream, it's a cold stage. The rich characters are not enviable, they are trapped in their own performance, and their power comes at the cost of sincerity. That's a refreshing shift from older dramas that treated chaebol life like a fairy tale with minor problems. Here, wealth is portrayed as corrosive, not because money itself is evil, but because the system around it incentivizes denial, control, and emotional illiteracy. The show's pacing and length allow it to explore consequences, and that's another reason it sticks with you. People don't just do something cruel and then move on, their cruelty echoes. Their choices create ripples in school, in friendships, in careers. And Soo-yun's choices, too, have costs. She doesn't get to be a normal teenager. She doesn't get to be carefree. Her youth is spent like currency. That's heartbreaking, and the series doesn't sugarcoat it. But it also doesn't wallow. It gives her moments of light, a laugh that surprises her, a small celebration, a walk in the city where she allows herself to imagine a future. Those moments matter because they remind you what she's fighting for. She's not fighting to become like them. She's fighting to become free. And as we approach the final emotional summary, without stepping on the ending, the verdict on Pewaris Jenius yang Terlahir Untuk Menang is this: it's a series that takes a familiar inheritance twist and uses it as a doorway into something more grounded and more relevant, a story about how brilliance can be both gift and burden when the world is determined to misunderstand you, and it delivers that story with strong performances, disciplined direction, and a tone that feels cinematic without losing intimacy. It's tense in a way that doesn't rely on explosions, emotional in a way that doesn't rely on cheap manipulation, and satisfying in a way that comes from watching a person claim herself piece by piece. If you're looking for pure escapism where the secret heir walks in, snaps her fingers, and everyone bows, this might frustrate you because it refuses to grant easy respect. But if you want something that feels like the truth of struggle, something that recognizes how hard it is to climb when the ladder is missing rungs, then this series will get under your skin and stay there. It will make you angry, it will make you proud, it will make you tired in sympathy, and then it will give you that rare, quiet kind of hope that doesn't come from miracles, but from persistence, the hope that even if your own family, your own society, your own circumstances try to write you out, you can still write yourself back in, with every page you study, every boundary you hold, every time you refuse to accept a life that someone else decided you deserve, and by the time the credits roll on your watch session and you realize your hands have been clenched for hours, you'll understand why the title isn't just a boast. It's a promise that winning doesn't always mean taking a throne. Sometimes winning means staying human, staying sharp, and walking into your future with your head up, not because the world finally approved of you, but because you finally did. Imagine growing up being told that the only thing you have, the only thing that will ever save you, is your brain, your grades, your ability to push harder than everyone else around you, and then one day discovering that actually, you were born with the golden ticket you always envied, the enormous company, the legacy surname, the kind of money that bends the world around it, but by the time it's revealed, it's already too late, because the people who were supposed to love you chose that golden ticket for somebody else, and all you have left is the mind you've sharpened like a weapon just to survive. That is the brutal, exhilarating heart of the 2026 Korean drama, Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang, a title that roughly translates to, The Genius Heir Born to Win, and I don't say this lightly. This is one of those rare series that starts like yet another underdog school drama and then, episode by episode, peels itself open into something much colder, much kinder, and much more devastating than you're ready for. A story where every exam paper becomes a battlefield and every family dinner feels like a hostage negotiation. Before we dive in and pick this thing apart piece by piece, I want you to settle into that feeling for a second, because if you've ever felt like the system was rigged against you, like you were carrying your family's expectations on your back, or like the only way out was through hard work that might never be rewarded, this drama is going to speak to you in ways that are almost uncomfortably personal. And before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I really want to know what corners of the world are watching the same stories, feeling the same pressure, and finding the same tiny sparks of hope in series like this. Now, Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang dropped in 2026 into a landscape already saturated with elite school thrillers, chaebol, inheritance wars, and survival stories about kids crushed under exam schedules, and yet somehow it manages to feel like both a culmination and a quiet rebellion against all of them. Directed by the fictional but very believable Lee Hyun-soo, someone whose imagined filmography would probably include a slow-burn family drama and at least one gritty urban movie about debt collectors, and written by screenwriter Jung Min-ta, whose pen here oscillates between razor-sharp corporate dialogue and painfully vulnerable monologues whispered in cramped student apartments at 3 a.m. The show was marketed as a mix between a coming-of-age story and a corporate succession drama, and if you watched the trailers you probably went in expecting a kind of mashup between Sky Castle and Reborn Rich, with a feminist twist, and you'd be half right. But what the trailers don't prepare you for is how much time we spend inside Moon Soo-yeon's head, really feeling how it is to live as a poor but brilliant high school student in Seoul, balancing part-time jobs, scholarship requirements, and the gnawing suspicion that no matter how well she does, the ceiling above her is made of bulletproof glass. The first episode opens not with a flashy boardroom scene or some dramatic hospital birth mix-up, but with Soo-yeon sitting in a freezing library before dawn, wearing a puffy jacket with a broken zipper, her hands shaking not from nerves but from lack of sleep and too much cheap coffee, underlining physics equations in a textbook that has someone else's name on the inside cover, and immediately the show tells you, this is the lens, this is where we start, not from luxury, but from exhaustion. And yet, because this is a K-drama and because the title literally screams destined to win energy, you know there's something bigger coming, something mythic under all the fluorescent lights and exam papers. And that latent promise is part of what makes the first few episodes so compulsively watchable. Even before the big air twist drops, the background concept of the show is simple enough on paper. Moon Soo-yeon, a girl from a low-income family, is ridiculously smart, the kind of top percentile student who racks up National Math Olympiad medals and destroys practice exams for fun, living in a cramped semi-basement apartment with a mother who works endless shifts in a small restaurant and a younger brother who already seems resigned to the idea that school isn't for him. The family barely scrapes by, depending on Soo-yeon's scholarships to keep her at an elite prep high school surrounded by students whose bags cost more than her entire monthly household budget. And there's this recurring image the director keeps cutting back to in those early episodes, Soo-yeon standing outside the campus gate, watching imported cars drop off kids who are complaining about test scores she would kill for, tightening the straps on her faded backpack before stepping into that world like she's entering enemy territory. We get the usual pressures, the teachers subtly favoring rich kids, the way group projects become social hierarchies made visible, the classmates who underestimate her because of her cheap shoes but then hate her quietly when she keeps ranking first in the class, and woven through it is this uneasy tension at home, these random moments where her mother will stop mid-sentence when a news story about a certain conglomerate plays in the background, or when a luxury black car passes by in their alley and her mom's eyes follow it a little too long. The conglomerate at the heart of all this is the Daejeong Mirai Group, a massive, generational company controlling everything from construction to tech to finance, a classic chaebol colossus that dominates the Seoul skyline and the nightly business news, and somewhere in its labyrinth of glass offices and old money mansions lives the girl who is publicly known as the heir, Moon Soo-jin, the polished, glamorous, thoroughly groomed daughter of the chairman who, in the first half of the show, exists more as a rumor and a reflection than as an actual person in Soo-yeon's world. The show plays a long game in intercutting their lives without letting them meet. When Soo-yeon is eating instant noodles for the third night in a row, we cut to Soo-jin poking at an artistic French dish at a charity gala, bored out of her mind. When Soo-yeon's old second-hand laptop freezes while she's trying to submit a national mock exam score, we cut to Soo-jin tossing aside a state-of-the-art tablet because she doesn't care what her scores are. She's already been told the company is hers, and this is where the central irony of the story begins to crystallize. One girl born into power but uninterested in earning it, and another girl born into struggle who is spending every last ounce of herself trying to reach a future she doesn't know she was already supposed to have. The heir twist, when it comes, is surprisingly understated, and that's one of the show's smartest choices. Instead of a dramatic accident or a screaming revelation in a hospital corridor, it starts with blood, a routine health check at school, a passing mention that Soo-yeon's blood type doesn't match what's on her birth certificate, a teacher's offhand comment that becomes a splinter in her mother's mind. From there, we see the past unfold in fragments, a rushed delivery years ago, a desperate deal between a terrified young woman and a powerful family, the kind of moral compromise that looks like salvation when you are standing in a hospital gown with no money and a crying infant. And the show slowly lets us understand that it's not just that Soo-yeon was switched at birth, it's that her entire life has been built on the decision of her own family to bury that truth and side with the money instead. When Daejeong Mirai's lawyers finally show up at their tiny apartment with their perfectly pressed suits and thick envelopes, it's not to welcome Soo-yeon home, but to make sure that she and her mother stay quiet, to formalize in contracts the betrayal that happened in whispers years ago. One of the most gutting early scenes comes when Soo-yeon walks in on her mother sitting with those lawyers, clutching a pen, and realizes this isn't some wild mistake being corrected, but a deal being reinforced, a choice being made again. There's this moment where the camera lingers on Soo-yeon's face in slow motion as her mother signs, and you can actually see in her eyes the exact second where she understands. You were never on my side, not really, not when it mattered. And yet, in typical human fashion, it's more complicated than that, because the show refuses to paint the mother as a cartoon villain. Instead, it gives us flashbacks of her breaking down after the birth, holding 2 babies and being told she can only save one. Future, of the Daejeong matriarch promising that the baby raised in the chaebol household would never want for anything, that she would get the life the poor woman could never give, and in that twisted logic, the mother convinces herself that what she did was selfless, that sacrificing the truth was a way of giving at least one version of her daughter a fair shot. And now, all these years later, confronted with the real, living, breathing girl who actually paid the price, she's paralyzed by guilt and greed, wanting to cling to the hush money and the illusion that it was all for the best, while Soo-yeon stands there, numb, listening to men in suits talk about her life like it's a clerical error. This is where the drama sets itself apart, because instead of pivoting immediately into revenge mode, it does something quieter and, honestly, more powerful. It shows us Soo-yeon choosing to walk away from all of it, not out of some martyr complex, but because she's too tired, too focused, too stubbornly grounded in the one thing she actually controls, her own effort. She goes back to her desk, her textbooks, her mock exams, and there's this almost defiant line she delivers to herself in the mirror: even if I was born with everything, I still would have studied. This is mine. That line becomes kind of the thesis statement of her character, and the show keeps circling back to variations of it as the stakes get higher. So let's talk about Soo-yeon as a character, because she's really the spine of this entire series, and the actress playing her, imagined here as Kim Dami or someone with that kind of grounded intensity, gives a performance that's all micro-expressions and clenched jaws and tiny fractures in her composure. Soo-yeon is not your typical spunky drama heroine who bounces back from every setback with a fist pump and a speech about dreams. She's quieter, more brittle, carrying this low-level anger that never fully explodes but burns just under the surface of almost every scene. The show gives her small joys, solving a difficult math problem, hearing her name announced as first in the nationwide mock exam rankings, sharing cheap tteokbokki with her one real friend from school, and you feel how precious they are because you've seen how little else she has. What I love is that the series never tries to romanticize her struggle, never pretends that hard work is beautiful in itself. It shows the nosebleeds, the panic attacks, the way her hands shake in the exam hall when she realizes she left her calculator at home, the way she stares at the ceiling at night wondering if any of this will be enough, and then, just when you think you understand her arc as the gifted poor kid who will climb her way to a scholarship at an elite university, the story pulls back the curtain on how rigged that path really is, not only socially but also intimately, within her own family. Her mom, instead of becoming her ally in the fight against the conglomerate, drifts further away, almost seduced by the idea that they can live comfortably now if they just accept that Soo-yeon's real life, her rightful inheritance, is off limits. There's a painful, almost unbearable scene where the mother proudly shows off the new fridge, the new sofa, the suddenly upgraded apartment, paid for by Daejeong Mirai hush money, and Soo-yeon just sits there, surrounded by these gleaming appliances that feel like monuments to her own erasure, and her younger brother, who has always felt overshadowed by her, starts parroting lines he's heard from adults about how she should be grateful their mom saved them from a scandal. You can see the wedge being driven through what little family warmth they had left. Contrast that with the household of the false heir, Moon Soo-jin, whose entire existence is built on the lie that she's a Daejeong bloodline. And you have this fascinating character dynamic where Soo-jin is neither a mustache-twirling villain nor a helpless innocent. She's a girl raised in a gilded cage, hyper-anxious because she senses that something about her place in that world is precarious, even before she learns the truth. The show gives us scenes of her gliding through luxury boutiques and high-end charity events, but also of her secretly taking practice tests late at night because she's terrified of being seen as stupid, as undeserving. Her relationship with the chairman, her supposed grandfather, is complicated. He dotes on her, sure, but always with this transactional edge, reminding her that the company needs a strong leader, that her every misstep reflects on the brand, that love is inseparable from performance. So when the truth finally reaches her, when she overhears a conversation between the adults about the real heir, her immediate reaction isn't some dramatized meltdown, it's this crushing, quiet horror. If I'm not really one of them, what am I? And if I'm not the heir, what was all this pressure for? One of the most morally complex threads in the show is the slow, reluctant relationship that forms between Soo-yeon and Soo-jin once they are aware of each other. Their first official meeting is orchestrated by the company, of course, in the sterile environment of a law firm conference room, where they are basically treated like liabilities that need managing. Soo-jin tries, awkwardly, to reach out, offering an apology that is more about easing her own guilt than about understanding Soo-yeon's anger, and Soo-yeon responds with this icy politeness that hides her rage beneath layers of self-control. What's smart is that the show doesn't rush them into sisterhood or rivalry. It lets them orbit each other, misjudging and resenting and occasionally empathizing, until the boundary between real and fake heir starts to feel like a sick joke played on both of them. During all this, the academic side of the story keeps moving, and that's where our other key characters come in, particularly Kang Ji-ho, the male lead who, on paper, is yet another genius from a prestigious background, but in execution turns out to be one of the more grounded, quietly perceptive characters in the series. Ji-ho is the son of a well-known professor at a top university, raised in an environment where achievement is just assumed, and when we first meet him, he's that annoyingly relaxed top student who seems to coast to high scores without breaking a sweat. What makes him interesting, though, is how the show gradually reveals his own pressure cooker, the father who views him less as a son and more as an extension of his academic legacy, the unspoken expectation that Ji-ho will slide into a comfortable future in the upper echelons of society without ever really questioning the system. Ji-ho meets Soo-yeon when they tie for first place in a national mock exam, a result that infuriates his father, who cannot accept that his son was matched by a no-name girl from a no-name school, and that's our entry point into their dynamic, rivals on paper, but with a mutual respect that begins the second Ji-ho realizes how hard Soo-yeon has to work to achieve what he's always taken for granted. There's this lovely, understated scene where Ji-ho sees her studying in a cramped corner of a public library, surrounded by stacks of borrowed books, and you can see something shifting in him as he realizes she's not just a number on a ranking sheet. Their chemistry isn't the swoony, love at first sight romance you often get in dramas. It's built on late-night study sessions, quiet acts of solidarity, and a shared sense of being used as tools by the adults in their lives, just in very different ways. What the show absolutely nails is the way their relationship never eclipses Soo-yeon's individual journey. Ji-ho is there, he's supportive, he challenges her, he refuses to pity her, but he never becomes the solution to her problems, and that choice alone earns the writing a ton of respect. From a cinematic standpoint, the series does something really effective with how it frames spaces. Soo-yeon's world is shot in tight, slightly claustrophobic close-ups, handheld cameras that jitter just a bit in scenes where she's cramming on crowded buses or washing dishes after a shift, emphasizing how little room she has to breathe or move. Daejeong Mi-rae's world, by contrast, is presented with wide, almost clinical shots of vast boardrooms and long corridors, steady tracking shots that make the people look small compared to the architecture, a deliberate reminder that hierarchy, not humanity, is what dominates those spaces. One of the standout visual motifs is the exam hall, which we see multiple times throughout the series, rows upon rows of identical desks, students hunched over papers, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the camera slowly panning across faces at different stages of panic and focus. The sound design in these scenes is incredible. They dial down the general noise and amplify tiny sounds like the scratching of pencils, the rustle of paper, the click of a clock hand, building this agonizing tension that really immerses you in what those exams feel like when your entire future seems to hinge on a single score. There's an early episode climax that takes place during the National College Entrance exam, where a minor scheduling mishap nearly causes Soo-yeon to miss the start time, and watching her sprint through the streets, shoes half-tied, tears streaming because she thinks this is it, this is how her life ends, academically speaking, is honestly more intense than many chase scenes in action movies. The director intercuts her desperate run with shots of her mother signing yet another confidentiality document and Soo-jin staring blankly at a corporate orientation packet, and the implication is clear. All three of them are trapped in systems that define them by roles they never chose. Thematically, the show is playing with this tension between destiny and self-determination. The title, Born to Win, sounds on the surface like some cheesy motivational phrase, but the narrative is constantly interrogating what it means to be born into anything: wealth, poverty, genius, expectation, and whether winning is even something worth idolizing when the game itself is broken. Soo-yeon's academic genius is portrayed as both her weapon and her burden. It gives her a path, sure, but it also isolates her, making her the target of jealousy, exploitation, and unrealistic hope from everyone around her. One of the mid-series arcs that really hits hard is when a cram school director tries to recruit her as a poster child for his academy, offering her free classes in exchange for using her face and name in marketing materials, and when she initially refuses, he bullies her with subtle threats about how competitive the college admissions process is, how one wrong move could tank her future. She ends up taking the deal out of fear, and there's something so true in that, the way even your talent can be commodified when you don't have the power to set your own terms. Thematically, the relationship with her family is where the show's emotional core really lives. The betrayal of her mother and, eventually, her younger brother choosing the comfort money over standing up for her is one of those slow-burn heartbreaks that feels almost too realistic. It's not that they don't love her, it's that their fear of going back to poverty outweighs their guilt, and they keep telling themselves that Soo-yeon is strong, that she'll be fine, that this is just how the world works. In a quieter drama, that might be the end of the conversation. But Pewaris Jenius young Terlahir Untuk Menang refuses to leave it there. We see the cumulative effect on Soo-yeon, the slight slump in her shoulders, the way she stops sharing her small victories with them because she knows they don't see her anymore, not really. And yet, we also get these piercing moments of tenderness, like when her mother absent-mindedly adjusts Soo-yeon's scarf before she goes out on a freezing morning, or leaves her favorite side dish in the fridge even after a vicious argument, as if love is this muscle memory the woman can't quite unlearn, even while she's actively choosing money over truth. That ambiguity, that sense that people can be both cruel and loving at the same time, gives the drama a depth that a lot of family melodramas don't reach. When it comes to performances, the entire cast is operating on a level that sells even the more heightened, soapier moments. The actress playing Soo-yeon has this uncanny ability to convey 5 emotions at once with just a twitch of her mouth, and her scenes with the chairman of Daejeong Mi-rae, especially once he discovers who she is, are some of the most electric in the series. The chairman himself is portrayed not as a cartoonishly evil CEO, but as a man who genuinely believes in meritocracy, at least when it benefits his company, yet is also deeply entrenched in the classist, bloodline-obsessed culture that allowed this entire mess to happen. When he meets Soo-yeon privately, testing her with riddles about market strategies and ethical dilemmas disguised as hypothetical questions, you can see him calculating, torn between the daughter he raised and the heir whose mind he clearly respects, and there are moments where you almost feel sorry for him as he realizes that, in trying to secure his legacy, he's created a situation where no choice will be both morally and strategically clean. The pacing of the series is interesting because it starts almost languid, taking its time to build Soo-Yun's daily life, her study routine, her relationships, and then, once the heir plot detonates, it accelerates, juggling corporate maneuvering, university admissions, family fights, and internal monologues all at once. Some viewers might find the early episodes slow, but I think that investment pays off in the back half when every choice she makes feels grounded in all the small sacrifices you've watched her endure. The midpoint of the drama, around episode 8 or 9 if we imagine a standard 16-episode run, is where Soo-Yun finally receives her national exam results. She has not only ranked first in her school, not only top in Seoul, but literally number 1 in the entire country, an achievement so massive that even Daejeong Mirai can't ignore it. News outlets start calling her the genius girl from the basement. Social media stands begin shipping her with Jiho based on a leaked photo of them leaving a library together, and universities fall over themselves trying to recruit her. And yet, the victory tastes bitter, because the same people who erased her identity are now trying to claim her as a PR asset, calling her inspiring, while quietly making sure she never mentions the inheritance scandal. There's a brilliant scene where a university president offers her a full ride plus a stipend, but it becomes clear that part of the deal is keeping her out of any public controversy with the conglomerate donating to the university. She's faced with this impossible choice: take the opportunity she's literally bled for and stay silent, or risk her future by fighting back publicly. The show doesn't give us a simple triumphant answer to that, and that's one of the reasons it sticks with you, without spoiling the exact way things play out in the final episodes. I will say that Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang resists the fantasy of an easy corporate takedown or a neat family reconciliation. Instead, it leans into smaller, harder-won victories, Soo-Yun gaining the power to choose for herself where and how she studies, Jiho finally confronting his father about the kind of life he wants, Soo-Jin redefining what it means for her to exist outside of the heir narrative, and even the mother, in her own halting, deeply flawed way, trying to make amends. There is a confrontation scene late in the series between Soo-Yun and Soo-Jin that feels like the emotional climax of the whole story. They meet not in some grand boardroom or at a fancy party, but on a rainy university campus, both drenched, both exhausted, both having just made massive decisions about their futures. Soo-Jin is grappling with the idea of stepping away from the company she's been groomed to lead, not because she suddenly grew a conscience, but because she realizes she doesn't know who she is without its expectations. Soo-Yun, on the other hand, is staring down an offer that would tie her to Daejeong Mirai as a kind of in-house genius, a role that would give her incredible power but also yoke her brilliance to the machine that hurt her. The way they talk to each other in that scene, without venom, without fake sisterly warmth, just two young women trying to navigate the wreckage of choices made before they were born, is devastating and cathartic. Cinematically, the rain acts almost like a character, blurring the campus lights, soaking their designer coat and cheap hoodie alike, reminding us that in the end, the weather doesn't care about your class. The cultural impact of the series, even as a thought experiment, is easy to imagine. In 2026, with education systems under fire all over the world, skyrocketing university costs, and a widening wealth gap, a story like this lands with particular force. Audiences online latch onto Soo-Yun as a kind of avatar of their own frustration and determination. Memes explode around her: "Even if I was born with everything, I still would have studied. This is my line," turned into motivational posters, sarcastic reaction images, and bitter commentary about grind culture. Smaller but equally passionate fandom circles build around Soo-Jin, arguing that she's just as much a victim of the system as Soo-Yun, and that her decision to step away from the heir role is, in its own way, a rebellion. Conversations spill over into real-world discourse about fairness in college admissions, legacy preferences, and the dehumanizing nature of corporate succession practices. The show strikes a nerve in Korea, of course, where stories about exam pressure are practically a genre of their own, but it also resonates across Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, where the localized title, Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang, speaks directly to a generation of students navigating similar anxieties about class and education. Critics praised the series for walking a careful line between melodrama and social commentary, for refusing to romanticize suffering while still allowing for moments of hope, humor, and connection. There are recurring small comedic beats, often revolving around Ji-ho's obliviousness to how poor people actually live, or a chill, deadpan teacher who low-key roots for Soo-yeon and isn't afraid to smack down snobby parents with the driest sarcasm. Those moments of levity are crucial. They keep the show from collapsing under the weight of its own intensity, and they remind us that even in the darkest grind, people laugh, people make dumb jokes, people find bits of joy. From a gaming channel perspective, which might sound like an odd angle at first, there's something almost game-like in how the show frames Soo-yeon's journey. Each exam is a boss fight, each scholarship a side quest, each corporate contract a dialogue choice with long-term consequences, and the resource she's constantly managing is not mana or gold, but time, mental health, and the fragile trust in the people around her. Watching her navigate those systems is as tense and strategic as watching someone attempt a no-death run in a brutally difficult game, and it raises this uncomfortable question: if life is a game, who gets to start with infinite continues, and who's forced into permadeath mode from birth? As the series heads toward its final stretch, the pacing does get a little chaotic. There's a subplot involving a leaked document about the birth switch, a corporate rival trying to use the scandal to oust the chairman, and even a brief media frenzy that threatens to reduce Soo-yeon's entire identity to a salacious headline. But the emotional through line remains solid. This is about a girl who refuses to let other people's labels define what she's capable of, and who learns, slowly and painfully, that winning doesn't always mean taking everything you're owed. Sometimes it means walking away from a poisoned prize with your integrity intact. One of my favorite choices in the final episode is that we don't end in a boardroom or at a fancy graduation ceremony. We end with Soo-yeon in a quiet college library, this time as a university student at an elite campus she clawed her way into. Not as a mascot for pity or a corporate pet project, but as a person who negotiated her own terms. She's still working part-time, still budgeting every meal, but there's a lightness to her that wasn't there before, a sense that she's finally studying for herself, not as a desperate escape but as an exploration of what she can do with this brain that almost consumed her. Ji-ho drops by, of course, plopping down across from her with coffee and notes for a joint project, and their banter is easy, familiar, not centered on tests or rankings but on ideas, on what kind of future they might build. The final shot intercuts her turning a page in a textbook with the chairman turning a page in a Daejeong Mirai annual report, Soo-jin turning a page in a brochure for an arts foundation she's considering joining, and her mother turning a page in a photo album filled with baby pictures she can barely bear to look at. It's a simple metaphor, maybe even a little on the nose, but it works. Lives move forward, chapters close and open, and the scars of what happened don't disappear, but they also don't define every page that follows. As a whole, Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang is one of those series that lingers in your mind not because of any single twist or big plot reveal, but because it captures a feeling of being young and terrified and determined in a world that keeps telling you your worth is a number, a surname, a bank balance. It invites you to sit with the discomfort of knowing that meritocracy is often a myth, that hard work alone rarely levels the playing field, but it also refuses to strip away all agency or hope. Instead, it suggests that even in a rigged game, there is dignity in how you play, in the lines you refuse to cross, in the boundaries you set for what you'll sacrifice. The performances are nuanced, the writing sharp, the cinematography thoughtful, and while it's not perfect, there are pacing issues, a couple of melodramatic secondary plot lines that feel undercooked, and at least one villainous uncle who strays a bit too close to caricature. It's the kind of imperfect that still feels deeply worthwhile, like a brilliant essay written at 3 a.m. with smudged ink and crossed out sentences. If you've ever stayed up all night studying, wondering if any of it would matter, if you've ever felt your stomach drop when you saw the price of tuition, if you've ever looked at someone born into wealth and thought, quietly, if I had what you have, I would burn the world with it, this drama is going to hit you in places you didn't know you had. And in the end, what makes it so affecting is that it doesn't tell you that you're secretly an heir, that a rich grandfather is going to swoop in and fix your life. It tells you that maybe you were born to win, in a different sense, not because of some hidden fortune, but because you have the capacity to endure, to think, to choose, to resist, to redefine what winning even means. As the credits roll on that final episode, with the OST swelling in this melancholic but hopeful piano theme, you're left with a strange mixture of anger and comfort. Anger at the systems that grind people down, comfort that somewhere, in stories and maybe in real life, there are still people like Moon Soo-yeon who refuse to let the world decide their value, and that, for a 2026 drama competing in a crowded landscape, is no small achievement. If you've watched it, I'd love to know which character you saw yourself in, which scenes made you pause the episode just to breathe, and whether you think Soo-yeon made the right choice in the end. So drop your thoughts down below, and if you haven't seen Pewaris Jenius yang Terlahir Untuk Menang yet, consider this your invitation to dive into a story that will make you rethink what it means to be gifted, to be poor, to be loved, and to be, in every sense that matters, born to win. Thinking about it more, there's an entire layer to Pewaris Jenius yang Terlahir Untuk Menang that we didn't really unpack yet, and if you've finished the series you probably felt it too, that creeping, almost physical sense of exhaustion that sinks into your bones while you're watching, the familiarity of that grind even if you never fought your way through Korea's brutal exam culture. It's the way the show turns studying into something cinematic without glamorizing it, and that might sound like a contradiction, but think back to those sequences where Soo-yeon is deep in prep mode. The camera never pulls out to give us that cliché hero shot of her standing over a mountain of books with a triumphant grin. Instead, we're right there in the space with her, close enough to see the small veins in her eyes, the yellow stain on her highlighter, the little sticky notes fraying at the edges from being moved and reused. When she's at her desk, the outside world disappears, not in a romantic she's so in the zone way, but in this eerily isolating way, where the only sounds are the scratching of her pencil, the ticking of a clock, and the occasional muffled laughter of people outside the window living a life that doesn't revolve around percentages and rankings. The director plays a lot with ambient noise, too. When Soo-yeon's anxiety spikes, the background sounds warp, muting out or amplifying randomly, so the rumble of the subway or the hum of fluorescent lights suddenly feels like static in your own ears, and I think anyone who has ever spiraled mentally during a high-stakes exam will recognize that sensation instantly. One of the more quietly heartbreaking arcs is when Soo-yeon starts keeping a sleep log and a study log, something her teacher suggested as a way to balance her health and performance, and at first it seems like a responsible strategy, a way of reclaiming control, but as the episodes go on, the log becomes another weapon she uses against herself, circling the hours she wasted, at work or with her one friend, scolding herself in the margins for not being efficient enough. And there's a scene where Ji-ho sees that notebook and his whole easygoing facade cracks for a second, because he realizes this isn't self-discipline, this is self-punishment. And speaking of Ji-ho, I want to dive deeper into his arc because, on a first watch, it's easy to just see him as the supportive male lead orbiting Soo-yeon's story, but if you pay attention, his journey is a clever deconstruction of what we think privilege looks like. At first glance, Ji-ho has it all, a supportive, or seemingly supportive, academic father, financial security, connections, natural intelligence, that carefree, slightly smug aura of someone who never had to think about money before ordering food. But the show starts poking holes in that facade early on, like when he mentions casually that his father has already mapped out his life until age 40 and has backup plans for what happens if he fails to reach certain milestones. It sounds like a joke at first, but later we see that literal chart drawn on a whiteboard in his father's office, with timelines, possible outcomes, and contingency paths labeled like some corporate growth strategy. Ji-ho's fate is as pre-written as Soo-jin's, just in a different register, and once he starts caring about something outside that script, specifically, Soo-yeon's future, and by extension his own sense of morality, the tension between his safe path and his conscience becomes unbearable. One of the standout Ji-ho scenes, at least for me, is when he explodes at his father after discovering that the man has been quietly consulting for Daejeong Mireille on the legal and educational optics of the birth scandal, essentially advising them on how to minimize damage while continuing the status quo. Ji-ho confronts him in their pristine living room, textbook still open on the table, and says something like, "You taught me to think critically, but only as long as I never criticize the hands that feed us," and his father responds with that weary, condescending line we've all heard from older generations at some point, "This is how the world works, you'll understand when you're older." But instead of swallowing it, Ji-ho doubles down, telling his father that if this is what adulthood looks like, he doesn't want it, and in that moment, this kid who was born into comfort shows more courage than some of the so-called self-made adults in the show. His arc isn't about giving up everything and running away, though, and that's important. He doesn't suddenly become poor for solidarity points or reject his education. Instead, his rebellion is quieter and more realistic. He uses the access he has to push back from within, leaking certain academic policy discussions to a sympathetic teacher, refusing to participate in rigged recommendation practices, and standing beside Soo-yeon when everyone around them is treating her like either a scandal or a trophy. The dynamic between Ji-ho and Soo-yeon really crystallizes in a scene around the mid-series mark, when they are both walking home after a school event, and she snaps at him, accusing him of pitying her, of treating her like some charity project to make himself feel better. He doesn't get defensive. Instead, he tells her honestly that he's still figuring out what it means to be her friend without overshadowing or speaking for her, that he doesn't always know the right move, but that he's willing to be called out and learn. In a genre that often leans on grand romantic gestures, that simple, vulnerable admission, "I don't know, but I'm listening," lands like a punch. It's also interesting how the show uses their academic collaboration as a barometer of their relationship. Early on, he offers her notes like he's handing down wisdom from a throne, and she bristles. Later, they are trading problem sets back and forth like equals, arguing over solutions, teaching each other niche tricks, each acknowledging areas where the other is stronger. There's this incredibly satisfying micro-moment in one of the later episodes where they are prepping for a national competition, and Ji-ho admits that her approach to a particularly brutal math problem is just superior to his, and instead of downplaying it, she actually allows herself a tiny, proud smile. It's the first time we see her accept praise from someone without immediately undercutting herself, and it feels huge. Now, we've talked about the big emotional beats and the main character arcs, but another thing that makes Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang feel so rich is the ecosystem of secondary characters, especially the adults in positions of power, because this show understands something crucial. Systems don't enforce themselves, people do. Take the homeroom teacher, Mr. Han, for example. At first he seems like the typical overworked, slightly jaded educator, the kind who cares, but not enough to burn himself out. He scolds Soo-yeon for dozing off in class, lectures her about balancing work and study, all the standard lines, but as we spend more time with him, we see that he's been quietly fighting his own battles, pushing for merit-based school policies, clashing with the principal over how much influence rich parents should have, trying to keep kids from dropping out when the odds are stacked against them. He becomes one of the few adults who actually sees Soo-yeon as a whole human being, not just a brain or a symbol. There's a beautiful moment when, after she wins the national top score, the school wants to parade her around as a success story, and she feels like they are using her as a shield against criticism for their treatment of poorer students. Mr. Han doesn't tell her to just smile and take it. Instead, he quietly pulls her aside and says, "You get to decide how they use your name. If you don't want it on their banner, say no, and if they don't listen, I'll back you up." It's a small act, but in a show full of adults telling young people that they have no real choices, Mr. Han's insistence that she does have some agency, even if limited, is radical. On the flip side, we have the principal and a handful of wealthy parents who embody the more insidious side of the education system, the ones who genuinely believe they are just looking out for their own kids, but whose every decision reinforces inequality. There's a parent-teacher conference episode that is almost horror-like in its tension, where Soo-yeon's mother, newly flush with Daejeong hush money, shows up wearing clothes that are just a bit too fancy, acting a bit too confident, and tries to sit with the rich moms. The discomfort is palpable. They recognize her as someone who doesn't truly belong, and they deploy that subtle, social violence language. "Oh, what shop is that from? Where do you live again? Which middle school did your daughter attend?" Questions that are less about curiosity and more about placing her on the social hierarchy. In contrast, when the Daejeong matriarch attends a similar meeting for Soo-jin, the entire room shifts, everyone suddenly deferential, teachers bending over backwards to accommodate her schedule, and the show doesn't need to spell anything out. The juxtaposition speaks for itself. Now, I want to go back to the Daejeong household, because another fascinating character there is the chairman's wife, the matriarch who orchestrated the baby switch all those years ago. In many stories she'd be written as the cold, ruthless corporate queen, and she definitely has that icy exterior. But the show gives her layers that complicate the hell out of how we feel about her. We learn that she herself married into wealth, that she spent her youth being patronized as the scholarship girl who got lucky, and that a big part of her obsession with bloodlines and real heirs comes from a deep, internalized insecurity about never having been fully accepted by her in-laws. When faced with the truth about Soo-yeon, she does what she's always done. She prioritizes the stability of the empire over the feelings of any individual, including her supposed granddaughter and her real one. But as the episodes progress, you can see cracks in her armor, moments where she watches footage of Soo-yeon speaking at an academic event and her face softens just a hair, or where she stands outside Soo-yeon's university library, looking in through the glass but not going inside, as if she's drawn to this girl she's determined to keep at arm's length. There's a late series confrontation between her and Soo-yeon that is just brutal in its emotional honesty. Soo-yeon marches into one of those immaculate Daejeong private lounges, not as a beggar or a secret granddaughter but as a woman who knows her worth, and she lays it out plainly. You stole my life, and then you tried to buy my silence. Keep your money, you can't afford what you took. The matriarch responds, not with denial, but with a chilling kind of pragmatism. Do you think your life would have been easier here? You think you would have been allowed to just be a student? You would have been groomed, watched, judged, every step controlled. You would hate me either way, and somehow, in that twisted way, she's right, and the show lets that uncomfortable truth hang in the air. This is one of the things I love most about the series. It resists the childish fantasy that there was a perfect timeline somewhere, a version of events where everyone made the right choice and everything turned out fair. Instead, it looks right at the mess and says, even if we rewound time, other kinds of damage would have been done. That doesn't excuse anything, but it does prevent the story from collapsing into simple victim and villain binaries. We should also talk about how the show handles mental health, because there's a really fine line between portraying the psychological toll of academic and family pressure and glamorizing breakdowns as noble suffering, and I think Pewaris Jenius young Terlahir Untuk Menang mostly lands on the right side of that line. When Soo-yeon has her first panic attack, it isn't shot as a beautiful slow-motion collapse with swelling strings. It's ugly, raw, almost claustrophobic. She's in the middle of a crowded street, people brushing past her, and suddenly she can't breathe, the camera closing in so tight on her face that we feel the walls closing in, too. There's no one there to catch her in a dramatic swoop, no immediate comfort. She slumps against a wall, forces herself through grounding exercises she must have read about online, and drags herself home. Later, after a particularly brutal confrontation with her mother, she experiences a more silent breakdown, not tears, just this numb staring at a blank page for hours, the pen hovering over the paper, unable to move. The drama doesn't just show these moments and move on, it folds them into her arc. She starts going to the school counselor, reluctantly at first, mocking the idea that talking could change anything, but over time using those sessions to unpack not just her stress about exams but the deeper wound of feeling unwanted, interchangeable, like her existence was an error someone tried to correct. Those scenes are some of the quietest in the show, often shot with warm, soft lighting instead of the harsh blue or grey we see in the rest of her life, and the counselor isn't some magical fixer. She's just a consistent presence who occasionally asks the right questions, allowing Soo-yeon to articulate feelings she's always turned into fuel instead of letting herself grieve. And if you're watching this as a student, especially someone going through your own intense academic journey, that depiction might hit a little too hard, but it also offers a subtle reminder that strength isn't just about pushing through. Sometimes it's about admitting you're tired and asking for help. Shifting gears a bit, one aspect of the show that I think doesn't get talked about enough, even in hypothetical fan discussions, is its use of technology and social media. The moment Soo-yeon's exam results go public and she's declared the top student in the country, her life is no longer just hers. Anonymous forums explode with posts about the genius from the basement. Some people call her an inspiration, others question whether someone from her background could really be that smart without cheating or favoritism. There's a scene where a classmate shows her a meme of herself, a badly photoshopped image that exaggerates her dark circles and adds a superhero cape, and laughs like it's harmless. Soo-yeon laughs along, but later that night we see her scrolling endlessly through posts about herself, heart racing, absorbing every compliment and every insult like they are all equally true. The series understands the double-edged sword of visibility. Her newfound fame opens doors, interviews, scholarships, sponsors, but it also turns her into a symbol people project their fantasies and frustrations onto, stripping away her privacy and nuance. There's even a subplot where a tutoring YouTuber tries to clout chase off her name, putting her face in thumbnails with titles like, "I react to genius poor girl's exam strategy," and it's honestly one of the most meta, darkly funny jabs at internet culture in the whole show. It's here that, as viewers on a channel like Bongo Gaming, we can really see the parallels between grind culture in education and grind culture in gaming. Both worlds obsess over rankings, leaderboards, optimization. Both have whales who pay to skip the line, whether it's pay-to-win players in games or parents who can afford private tutors, test prep, and backdoor influence. Both create this illusion that if you just work harder, if you just minute-max your build or your study habits, You can stand shoulder to shoulder with people who were born into massive advantages, and what Pewaris Jenius young Terlahir Untuk Menang does is rip the mask off that illusion, not to say that effort is meaningless, but to show that it's never happening on a level playing field. Watching Suyun grind for her scores feels a lot like watching a free-to-play player refuse to give up in a game clearly designed to favor those who can spend. And I think that's why the show resonates so much with younger audiences who recognize their own daily battles in that metaphor. Let's talk about the OST too, because the music in this drama isn't just background flavor, it's almost like a diary scribbled in sound. The main theme, a sparse piano melody with this slightly off-kilter rhythm, plays during many of Suyun's solitary moments, but what's clever is how it changes depending on the context. When she's studying with a sense of purpose and hope, the melody is clear and steady. When she's spiraling, the same notes are warped, slowed down, or drowned under ambient noise, like the song itself is struggling to break through the chaos. There's also a recurring guitar track that shows up in scenes of tentative connection, particularly between Suyun and Ji-ho, or Suyun and her friend from the convenience store job. It has this warm, slightly nostalgic tone, grounding the story in small moments of normalcy amidst all the high-stakes drama. One of the standout musical moments comes toward the end of the series when Suyun gives a speech at a university panel on educational equity. Instead of swelling into anthemic strings, the soundtrack pulls back, almost disappears, letting the tremor in her voice and the murmurs of the audience carry the emotion. Only as she finishes, choosing not to drop any bombshell about her birth but instead talking about the thousands of unnamed students who will never be invited onto a stage, does the piano quietly re-enter, like a heartbeat steadying after a long run. Cinematically, that choice to prioritize her words over the score is so effective, because it underlines the central idea: her value isn't in the spectacle, it's in the clarity and courage of her thought. And speaking of that speech, it's one of those central moments where the show really lays its cards on the table thematically. She looks out at a room full of academics, donors, and cameras, fully aware that Daejeong Mirai's XX are watching from behind the scenes. And instead of airing her personal grievances, she zooms out. She talks about how the system loves individual stories of triumph from the underclass because they make inequality look surmountable. If you show one girl like me on this stage, she says, you can pretend you've done your part, that the system works because look, sometimes poor kids make it, but for every one of me, there are thousands who worked just as hard and never had a camera pointed at them, never got a second chance when life tripped them up. If you really want to help, stop using us as proof that the game is fair, admit that it isn't. You can almost hear the oxygen leave the room as she says it, and that monologue, more than any corporate showdown or courtroom scene, is where the drama's spine reveals itself. It's not just about one genius heir, it's about who gets to be seen as exceptional and why, and what stories we choose to amplify to make ourselves feel better about systemic injustice. Now, in terms of pacing, the one thing I think some viewers might struggle with is how the show intentionally denies certain catharses. There is no big gotcha moment where Daejeong is publicly humiliated, no immaculate media scandal that topples the old guard. Instead, consequences are incremental and personal. The chairman's reputation takes a hit, sure, but he's still wealthy, still powerful. The mother's guilt doesn't vanish just because she finally makes a sacrificial choice late in the game. Sejin's attempt to define herself outside of the company doesn't come with instant fulfillment. She flounders, she fails at her first independent project, she cries in a cheap studio apartment because she misses the security she walked away from. For some viewers used to more bombastic endings, that might feel unsatisfying, but if you sit with it, it's one of the most honest things the show does. Life doesn't give you clean season finales, it gives you a series of messy, overlapping arcs where some problems resolve while others linger. On rewatch, you can start to appreciate how deliberately the show plants seeds for that messiness, how it refuses to let any one gesture fix years of hurt. For instance, when Suyun's mother finally stands up to the Daejeong lawyers in the final stretch, refusing more money and admitting her wrongdoing in front of a small crowd, the show doesn't suddenly make her a saint. Suyun doesn't fall into her arms. Instead, we get a painfully awkward, half-reconciled relationship where they are both trying, stumbling, and sometimes failing to connect again. Some viewers wanted a full cut-off, others wanted a tearful reunion. But what we get instead is this complicated in-between that, honestly, resembles real estranged families more than anything else. Let's zoom out to audience reaction within the universe of the show for a second, because one of the coolest meta touches is how it shows ordinary people reacting to the rumor of a genius poor girl who is actually a lost chaebol heir. On online forums, you see people projecting their own fantasies. Some insist she must take the company and show those old rich families what real talent looks like. Others argue she should reject the money on principle. Some doubt the story entirely, calling it a PR stunt. And in those scattered comments, you can see all the expectations that get dumped onto anyone who becomes a symbol. Everyone wants her to validate their worldview. What the series ultimately has her do is refuse to be a symbol for anyone but herself. She takes what she needs, leaves what would corrode her, and accepts that people will judge her no matter what. That's a level of autonomy we rarely get to see granted to characters in this kind of setup, and it's quietly revolutionary. And this is where, as a viewer, you might find yourself asking, okay, but what would I have done if you discovered you were the true heir to a conglomerate that destroyed your childhood? Would you storm the castle and take what's rightfully yours, or would you walk away and build something from scratch? Even if it meant struggling longer, there's no right answer, and the show doesn't pretend there is. Instead, it poses the question and then sits back, trusting you to wrestle with it after the credits roll. On a craft level, another thing I really appreciate is the editing, especially the way the series uses parallel cuts to link characters who are physically apart but thematically connected. We've talked about some of those intercuts. Soo-yeon struggling with a broken laptop while Soo-jin tosses aside the latest tech, or the chairman reviewing financial reports while Soo-yeon reviews exam results. But on rewatch you notice even subtler ones. The way a shot of Soo-yeon tying her shoes before a part-time shift is followed by a shot of Ji-ho lacing up his formal shoes before a prestigious debate, both of them bracing for battle in their own arenas. Or the way a scene of Soo-jin practicing a fake smile in the mirror before a press conference is mirrored by Soo-yeon practicing a neutral expression before facing her mother. Those visual rhymes create an emotional coherence that sneaks up on you, making the world feel intertwined even before the plot reveals why. And if you're someone who loves dissecting shows shot by shot, frame by frame, this is one of those series where every rewatch reveals new echoes and nuances. Of course, no drama is complete without at least a few missteps, and I'd be lying if I said Pewaris Jenius yang Terlahir Untuk Menang was flawless. There's a minor subplot involving a corporate cousin trying to sabotage Soo-jin's succession that feels underdeveloped, and a couple of episodes where the focus drifts a bit too long into boardroom politics at the expense of the more compelling student-centric storyline. Some viewers might roll their eyes at the one or two over-the-top melodramatic sequences, like the uncle dramatically collapsing after a heart attack mid-argument, that feel lifted from an older era of K-drama, but even those missteps are somewhat softened by the strength of the core narrative. They become like the messy handwriting on the margins of an otherwise brilliant exam essay, not ideal, but also not enough to drag the grade down, and if anything, the occasional melodrama gives the show a texture, a reminder that it's still part of a tradition, paying homage to the heightened emotions that made Korean television globally beloved in the first place. When all is said and done, what stays with me most about this series isn't the twist of the birth secret, or the high-stakes exams, or even the moral dilemmas in the Daejeong boardroom. It's the smaller, quieter images, Soo-yeon sitting on a rooftop at sunset, textbooks closed for once, listening to the city hum below her and wondering who she might have been if she hadn't spent her whole life running, Ji-ho leaving his father's office for the first time without a clear plan, pocketing a key card to the campus lab because he's decided to work on something of his own instead of just furthering his dad's research, Soo-jin taking off a designer watch given to her by the chairman and setting it in a drawer she then tapes shut, a symbolic little act of mutiny. Her mother standing outside a university gate watching students pour out, clutching a cheap bouquet she's too ashamed to actually hand to her daughter. Each of these moments feels like a save point in an RPG, a checkpoint where the character's stats have quietly leveled up, not in intelligence or wealth, but in self-knowledge. For a channel like this, where we spend so much time talking about progression systems in games, about grinding XP, about choosing builds and navigating moral choices in branching narratives, there's something kind of beautiful about a show that takes those same mechanics and anchors them in the very real, very messy, very high-stakes realm of human life. If I had to sum up Pewaris Jenius yang Terlahir Untuk Menang in one feeling, it would be this strange mix of rage and tenderness, a rage at how unfair the world is, how brutally it can treat someone like Soo-yeon, but also a tenderness for her stubborn hope, her refusal to let that unfairness turn her cruel or apathetic. You leave the series not with the fantasy that hard work will magically make everything right, but with a deeper understanding of what it costs to strive, and a renewed respect for the people in your own life who are doing that every single day without fanfare. Maybe it's your friend juggling school and 2 part-time jobs, or your sibling studying late into the night, or even your own younger self, the one who kept going when no one was watching. And that's where this drama really sinks its hooks into you, not by promising that you, too, might secretly be an heir, but by honoring the genius of survival in ordinary people, the quiet brilliance of those who keep showing up to a rigged game and playing anyway, not because they are naive, but because they've decided that their effort, their integrity, their love for the few people who truly see them, are victories no one can take. And if, after watching, you find yourself looking a little more kindly at the students hunched over their notebooks in coffee shops, or questioning the narratives we're sold about success and merit, or even just pausing before you judge someone's failure without knowing their starting point, then Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang has done something more lasting than just entertain. It's nudged your perspective, just a bit, in the direction of empathy, and that might be the most meaningful win of all. And yet even after that first wave of catharsis, the series doesn't let you simply clap, call it inspiring, and move on, because Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang has this almost stubborn commitment to the aftertaste of success, the kind that lingers long after the big moment and asks, quietly, what it cost, and who is still paying even when the scoreboard finally looks fair. And that's where the show's later stretch becomes oddly haunting, because it starts turning the spotlight away from the obvious cruelty of the conglomerate family and toward the subtler, more universal discomfort of upward mobility itself, that weird dislocation where you fight so hard to reach a new world and then realize you don't fully belong in the old one anymore either. And the show captures that not with speeches but with atmosphere, with Soo-yeon walking through spaces that are technically better, and still feeling like she's trespassing, with her shoulders slightly tense as if she expects a hand to grab her collar and drag her back down the stairs. One of the most cinematic tricks the series pulls is how it makes ordinary objects feel like symbols without ever turning them into cheesy props. A student ID card becomes a passport, a stack of practice exams becomes a shield, a scholarship notice becomes both lifeline and target, even something as simple as a uniform blazer or a worn backpack becomes a kind of emotional biography. And the show keeps returning to these tactile details because Soo-yeon's life has always been tactile, always measured in what she can physically carry and what she has to physically endure, while the rich family's world is measured in abstractions, shares, reputations, optics, risk, narrative, and the contrast makes every collision between those worlds feel like a clash between reality and theater. There's a moment, again staying general, where a family member tries to speak to Soo-yeon in the language of deals, offering her support in exchange for compliance, and what's so chilling isn't the offer itself but the assumption behind it. The assumption that everything has a price, including dignity, including identity, including a daughter, and Soo-yeon's response, whether she answers out loud or simply with her eyes, lands like a slap because it exposes how differently they understand the word family. For them, family is an institution to protect. For her, family is supposed to be a place where you don't have to negotiate for your own humanity. And the series keeps twisting that knife by showing how easily people confuse provision with love, as if paying for someone's tuition is the same as showing up for them emotionally, as if money can replace apology, as if comfort can substitute for belonging. What makes Soo-yeon such a gripping character to spend hours with is that she's smart enough to see the trap in every shiny offer, but she's also young enough that the temptation still hurts, because of course it does. Anyone in her situation would feel the pull of an easier path, the seduction of not having to count coins, not having to choose between a workbook and dinner, not having to watch your mother's face tighten when bills arrive. And the show lets you feel that pull without shaming her for it, which is crucial, because too many stories treat poor protagonists like they must be morally pure to deserve sympathy, and Pewaris Jenius refuses that moral policing. It allows Soo-yeon to want more, to want comfort, to want safety, to want recognition, and it portrays those wants as human, not greedy. The academic competition element also becomes more layered as the series continues, because it stops being just Soo-yeon versus rich kids, and turns into something more psychologically complex, Soo-yeon versus the version of herself that's been built purely for survival, the version that can endure anything but doesn't know how to rest, the version that equates worth with performance because performance has been the only currency she's ever been allowed to use, and watching her realize that is both empowering and painful, because you start noticing how she flinches at kindness, how she anticipates betrayal even from people who haven't earned her suspicion, how she keeps her dreams small not because she lacks ambition but because big dreams feel like invitations for disappointment. The show's writing gets a lot of mileage out of the exam culture setting by treating it like a moral laboratory. Everyone is under pressure, and pressure reveals values. So you see which characters cut corners, which characters bully to climb, which characters collapse under expectations, which characters weaponize privilege while insisting they worked hard too. And in the middle of all that is Soo-yeon, who doesn't have the luxury of romanticizing hard work because for her, hard work isn't a vibe, it's a life support machine. And that difference in stakes becomes a recurring source of tension in her friendships. There's a particular kind of scene the show nails repeatedly. Soo-yeon in a group study setting, surrounded by students who casually reference tutors, overseas camps, my dad's friend at the university, and she stays quiet, not because she's intimidated intellectually, but because she's doing the math of social survival, calculating how much of her truth she can reveal without becoming a spectacle. And the camera often lingers on her hands in those moments, the way she grips a pen too tightly, or taps her finger against the table, small signs of the energy she spends not just thinking but managing perception. That management of perception is one of the show's most important themes, and it's where the plotline becomes more than melodrama. Soo-yeon's existence is a perception problem for the conglomerate family, and the series shows how perception can be weaponized as effectively as any physical force, because if they can control how people see her, if they can paint her as unstable, as opportunistic, as a poor girl chasing money, as a liar, as a threat, then they don't have to actually address the truth, they can simply drown it in a story louder than reality, and the show's depiction of that feels disturbingly contemporary, like it understands how institutions respond to inconvenient truths, not by disproving them, but by smearing the person telling them. What's satisfying is that Soo-yeon doesn't counter with an equally loud narrative, she counters with an unignorable record, paper trail of excellence, the kind that can't be easily dismissed without exposing the dismissers as corrupt, and that's where her decision to chase top national rankings becomes not just ambition but strategy, because in a system that respects numbers more than people, she becomes a number too big to bury. But the show doesn't pretend that numbers are neutral, it constantly reminds you that even metrics can be manipulated, that access to preparation is a form of structural cheating, and it finds ways to dramatize that without turning into a documentary, like showing you the contrast between a student who studies in a quiet private room with a personal tutor and Soo-yeon studying on public transport, her head bouncing slightly with every stop, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, and the fact that she can still compete at all is portrayed as both heroic and horrifying. The fake airs arc, meanwhile, grows increasingly tense because the writers understand that her greatest fear isn't punishment, it's irrelevance, it's being returned to anonymity after being raised as a centerpiece, and there's something tragically believable in watching someone cling to an identity they didn't choose but are now addicted to, and the show uses her to explore a different form of poverty, not financial poverty, but emotional poverty, the kind that comes from being loved conditionally, where you learn that affection is a performance review, and if you fail, you're out. In that way, the series avoids a simplistic, poor good, rich bad, morality, because it's actually more interested in systems than individuals, and it shows you how wealth can distort relationships into transactions, how it can teach people to equate control with care, and how it can make truth feel dangerous because truth threatens stability, and stability is what keeps the machine profitable. That machine, the conglomerate itself, is portrayed not as a singular villain but as a living organism made up of cowardice, complicity, and self-interest, and some of the most memorable scenes are the ones where adults discuss Soo-yeon as if she's weather, as if she's an external event to manage, not a child whose life they directly shaped. The show's emotional power also comes from how it handles the idea of blood. In many air narratives, blood is treated like destiny, like a mystical key, but here blood is treated more like evidence, and evidence is only useful if someone is willing to acknowledge it, and that's a brutal truth to sit with. Being right doesn't matter if the people in power decide rightness is inconvenient. Soo-yeon's relationship with that truth evolves over the series. Early on, you can sense a part of her that still wants the fantasy, still wants to believe that if she's truly their daughter, something will awaken in them, some buried instinct of love, some sense of responsibility, but the series gradually strips that fantasy away in a way that feels both heartbreaking and strangely liberating, because once Soo-yeon stops expecting them to become what they should have been, she's free to become what she actually is, not what they want her to be. That liberation is not neat, though, it's messy, full of grief, because letting go of a family you never really had is still a form of mourning, and the show respects that grief. It gives Soo-yeon moments where she looks at something luxurious, an ornate dining table, a a family portrait, a clean, quiet study room, and you can see her imagining an alternate life that could have been hers if adults had made different choices, and then you see her swallow that vision like it's bitter medicine and keep walking, and that's the kind of subtle acting and direction that makes the show feel cinematic rather than soap operatic. The series also excels at portraying the social politics inside school, which is honestly its own kind of kingdom. There are hierarchies of popularity, of wealth, of academic rank, and the show demonstrates how those hierarchies echo the larger society, training kids early to accept inequality as normal, and Soo-yeon's presence disrupts that training because she's proof that talent can come from anywhere, and when people are confronted with that proof, their reactions reveal who they are. Some are inspired, some are threatened, some are curious, some are cruel, and the show refuses to make those reactions one-dimensional. There's a classmate archetype here that I found particularly effective, the student who is not evil, just terrified of falling behind, terrified of disappointing parents, terrified of losing a future that's been promised, and that terror makes them lash out at Soo-yeon, because if Soo-yeon can rise from nothing, then the privileged student has no excuse, and that is a psychologically sharp observation that the series keeps returning to. People often resent the underdog not because they hate them personally, but because the underdog's existence exposes how fragile their own sense of deservingness is. The show's cinematography supports this with frequent shots of rankings posted on walls, names stacked like a ladder, and the way characters stare at those lists is filmed like staring into a mirror that judges you, and Soo-yeon's relationship to those lists is complicated. They are both weapon and wound, because yes, they can validate her, but they also reduce her to a number in a way that echoes the rich family's reduction of her to a problem. That's where the series' intelligence really shows. It understands that oppression often wears different masks but uses the same logic. You are valuable only insofar as you are useful, and Soo-yeon's journey becomes about rejecting that logic, even as she uses the system's tools to survive. Another aspect that deserves more attention is the way Pewaris Jenius portrays adults outside the conglomerate family, teachers, administrators, employers, because it doesn't let them off the hook either. Not everyone is malicious, but many are passive, and the show points out that passivity can be a form of harm, especially when it protects the status quo. There are moments where an adult sees injustice and chooses to stay out of it, and the series frames that choice not as neutrality but as alignment with power, and that's a message that lands hard because it's true in real life. The system survives on people who tell themselves they are not involved. But the show also gives you adults who try, who make imperfect attempts to help, and those attempts matter, because they suggest that change doesn't always come from heroic saviors. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people making small brave choices in the moments that count. It's also worth talking about the emotional rhythm of the series, because the best long-form shows know when to squeeze you and when to let you breathe, and Pewaris Jenius is surprisingly good at that. After a particularly heavy episode, say, one where Soo-yeon is publicly humiliated or where the family's rejection becomes undeniable, the next episode might open with something almost mundane, Soo-yeon making instant noodles, or walking to school in early morning light, or sitting in a library where the only sound is pages turning, and those quieter sequences aren't filler, they are recovery, they are the show giving you space to process, and they also emphasize the central truth of Soo-yeon's life. No matter what drama erupts around her, she still has to wake up and do the work. That repetition becomes almost meditative, like a heartbeat, and it's what makes the big spikes in tension feel earned rather than manufactured. The series' music choices, too, are often understated in the best way. Instead of telling you what to feel, the score tends to underline mood gently, letting the performances do the heavy lifting, and when the music does swell, it feels like a release valve, like the show is finally allowing the emotion that characters have been suppressing. And suppression is a key word here, because so much of the drama is built on what is not allowed to be said. The rich family cannot acknowledge Soo-yeon without risking scandal. The fake heir cannot admit her fear without risking collapse. Soo-yeon cannot fully express her rage without risking being labeled unstable. Everyone is trapped by the consequences of honesty, and the show uses that to create a constant low hum of tension. One of the most effective ways it visualizes this is through framing at family gatherings and formal events. Characters are often positioned in symmetrical compositions like a portrait, beautiful and stiff, and you can feel the weight of tradition pressing them into shape, and Soo-yeon, when she appears in these spaces, often looks like a glitch in the picture, like a pixel that doesn't match the palette, and the camera leans into that discomfort, making you feel the social pressure as physical. force. There's also a subtle but persistent critique of the perfect student myth. Soo-yeon is brilliant, yes, but the show doesn't portray her as immune to burnout. There are moments when her eyes go unfocused, when her mind stutters, when she forgets something simple because she's running on fumes, and the show treats those moments with compassion rather than punishment. It doesn't shame her for being human. In fact, it uses those moments to highlight how unfair her situation is. She has to perform perfection just to be treated as baseline worthy. Meanwhile, privileged students are allowed to be mediocre and still be assumed capable. That double standard is one of the most infuriating parts of the series, and it's supposed to be infuriating. It's the kind of infuriating that makes you sit up and go, wait, why is that so familiar? And that's where the cultural impact becomes personal. Viewers who have lived any version of this, being judged more harshly because of class, accent, background, neighborhood, skin tone, anything, will recognize the microaggressions, the subtle exclusions, the way people smile while closing doors. And the show doesn't just show those doors closing, it shows the mental toll of hearing the click of a lock again and again. But it also shows the power of choosing a different door entirely, which is what Soo-yeon ultimately does by focusing on university as an exit route. And here's where I want to emphasize something that makes this series stand out: it doesn't fetishize the conglomerate as the ultimate prize. In many similar stories, the happy ending is the protagonist taking over the company or being embraced by the rich family, but Pewaris Jenius repeatedly suggests that true victory might be walking away from that toxicity, building a life that doesn't require their approval, and that's a much more modern, psychologically healthy fantasy, because it's not about inheriting power, it's about escaping a system that turns love into leverage. The show still understands, though, that walking away is complicated when wealth is tied to justice. Soo-yeon's lineage is not just money, it's truth, it's history, it's a stolen narrative, and the series explores the tension between wanting to be free of the family and wanting accountability from them. That tension is one of the show's best engines, because it's relatable. When someone wrongs you, you don't just want to leave, part of you wants them to admit it, to understand it, to feel it. And when they refuse, you're left with the question, do you keep chasing their acknowledgement, or do you choose peace without it? The series doesn't rush Soo-yeon to an answer, it lets her wrestle with it. It also uses the elite university goal in a way that feels symbolically rich. University isn't just education here, it's social mobility, network access, legitimacy in the eyes of institutions. It's the kind of stamp that makes people stop asking, who are you to be here, and start asking, how can we use you? And that shift is portrayed as both empowering and dangerous. Because being recognized by power doesn't necessarily mean being respected as a person, sometimes it just means you've become valuable enough to exploit. The show hints at that future in how certain adults begin to treat Soo-yeon once her achievements become public. Suddenly doors open, suddenly compliments appear, suddenly she's invited into rooms she was previously blocked from, and the show makes those moments feel eerie rather than purely satisfying, because you can sense the conditionality of it, the way the world's warmth is tied to her utility. That's where Soo-yeon's emotional intelligence becomes as important as her academic intelligence, because she has to learn how to accept opportunities without becoming owned by them, how to take help without being bought. And the series is at its best when it dramatizes that balancing act. There's also a thread in the story about isolation versus community, and it's surprisingly moving. Soo-yeon's instinct is to go alone, because going alone is safer, fewer attachments means fewer vulnerabilities. But the show gradually introduces the idea that community can be a different kind of strength, not the kind that rescues you, but the kind that reminds you you're not crazy for feeling hurt, the kind that holds your hand steady when your resolve starts to shake. And again, the show doesn't romanticize community as perfect. Friends mess up, misunderstandings happen, people project their own insecurities onto each other, but the series suggests that even imperfect connection is better than total emotional starvation. That message lands especially hard in a story where the rich family has plenty of people around but no real warmth, while Soo-yeon, even with fewer resources, gradually finds pockets of genuine care. That contrast becomes one of the show's most hopeful notes. You can be materially poor and still find emotional richness, and you can be materially rich and emotionally bankrupt. In terms of audience reaction, I've seen how people talk about this series like it's not just entertainment but a kind of therapy session they didn't know they needed. People replay scenes where Soo-yeon refuses humiliation, not because it's badass, but because it models boundaries in a world that trains underdogs to accept disrespect. People get emotional over scenes where she's simply allowed to rest for a moment, because rest is portrayed as something she has to earn, and that reflects how many viewers live, always tired, always proving, always trying to justify their existence through productivity. The series taps into that collective exhaustion and then offers a form of catharsis that isn't simplistic. It doesn't say, work hard and you'll be rewarded. It says, work hard because you deserve a chance, and even if the world doesn't reward you fairly, your effort is still real, your growth is still real, your boundaries are still yours. That's a more honest form of inspiration. The cultural impact also shows up in the way people debate the fake heir character. Some viewers hate her with a passion, others empathize, others argue about whether she is a victim of the adults, whether she had a choice, whether she could have done the right thing and given up her place. And the fact that those debates are so intense is proof the character is written well enough to feel like a person rather than a plot device. The show encourages those debates by refusing to give you an easy moral release. It keeps reminding you that teenagers don't build these systems, adults do. The fake heir didn't design the lie, she was raised inside it. And while she is still responsible for her actions, the show makes you confront how responsibility becomes complicated when your entire identity is built on something false. That's uncomfortable, and the show likes discomfort. It uses discomfort to push you past the shallow pleasures of revenge fantasy and into something more reflective. What does justice look like when everyone involved has been shaped by harm? The series also uses media within the story, public perception, rumors, whispered narratives, to show how truth becomes a battlefield. There are moments where you feel the tension of a name trending, a rumor spreading through a school, a headline shaping reality faster than facts can catch up, and that's another reason the show feels so current. It understands that in modern life, you can lose your future in an afternoon if the wrong story takes hold. Soo-yeon's strategy, then, becomes not just academic but reputational. She has to think like a player in a game she never asked to join. And watching her do that is both thrilling and sad, because it means she's being forced to grow up too fast. The show's title keeps echoing ironically through all of this, because if she's born to win, why does winning require such constant self-defense? And the answer the series seems to offer is that she wasn't born to win because of her blood, she was born to win because she has the rare combination of intellect, will, and moral clarity to keep her soul intact in a world that keeps trying to auction it off. That's why the most powerful victories in the show are often invisible to outsiders. Soo-yeon choosing not to lie even when lying would be convenient, Soo-yeon choosing not to humiliate someone who humiliated her, Soo-yeon choosing to protect a friend instead of using them as a stepping stone, Soo-yeon choosing to walk away from a conversation that would poison her spirit. Those choices don't show up on a transcript, but they're the real character arc, the real proof that she's not just smart but wise. If we talk about pacing again, the series' later episodes tend to tighten, and you start feeling the pressure of converging plotlines, exams approaching, university stakes rising, family secrets bubbling, the fake heir's desperation escalating, and the show does a strong job of making all of that feel like one storm rather than separate story threads. The editing becomes sharper, scenes become more loaded, conversations become more dangerous. And the show's sense of inevitability, the feeling that something has to break, grows stronger. But even as the tension rises, the series keeps returning to the quiet heart of the story, Soo-yeon at a desk, under a lamp, making a future out of pages. There's something almost spiritual about the way it films those scenes, as if studying is not just preparation but prayer, not to a god, but to the idea of a life that is hers. And because this is a review script, I also want to address the question viewers always ask with shows like this: is it satisfying? Does it pay off? Without spoiling the exact outcomes, I'll say the series understands that satisfaction comes in layers. It gives you moments of punchy catharsis, yes, moments where someone finally hears a truth they've been dodging, moments where Soo-yeon's excellence becomes undeniable, moments where a mask slips in public. But it also gives you quieter payoffs that feel more emotionally true, moments where Soo-yeon stops seeking permission, moments where she lets herself be cared for, moments where she redefines what family means. And if you go in expecting a clean, total victory where every wrong is corrected and every cruel person is punished in proportion, you might feel a little restless, because the show is more interested in realism than cosmic justice. Some people don't get what they deserve. Some people escape consequences. Some apologies never come. But the show frames that not as defeat, it frames it as a challenge. Can you still live fully even without perfect closure? And that's a mature, slightly painful message that lingers. Another thing the series does well is show how intelligence can be lonely. Soo-yeon's mind moves fast, her priorities are intense, her stakes are heavy, and even people who care about her may not fully understand the shape of her fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing one slip could undo years of effort. The show doesn't treat that loneliness as a quirky trait, it treats it as a wound. But it also portrays the possibility of being understood, not completely, but enough. There are scenes where someone doesn't try to fix her, doesn't say, "It'll be fine," but simply sits with her in silence, and those scenes are surprisingly emotional because they show a form of love that isn't transactional. In a story filled with transactional relationships, non-transactional care feels revolutionary. That's also why the series' depiction of the conglomerate family is so effective. It's not just that they are cruel, it's that their relationships are built on conditions. Love is a reward. Acceptance is a contract. Even the fake heir's position is conditional. And once you see that, you realize the mansion isn't a home, it's a stage where everyone is terrified of being replaced. Soo-yeon, ironically, becomes the most emotionally free person in the story precisely because she has had nothing guaranteed. She learns to live without their approval, and that gives her a kind of inner sovereignty the rich characters don't have. It's a beautiful inversion. The poor girl has more spiritual wealth than the wealthy family. That's not a new idea in storytelling, but Pewaris Jenius makes it feel fresh by grounding it in the specifics of academic struggle and institutional cruelty. Now, because we're building toward a full long-form review experience, let me zoom in on the show's tone, because tone is where many dramas stumble. This series walks a tightrope between bleak and hopeful. It shows harsh realities without turning into misery porn, and it offers hope without turning into propaganda. It does that by anchoring hope not in external rescue but in internal growth and in small human connections. The bleakness is never aestheticized, it's felt. When Soo-yeon is exhausted, you feel it. When she's humiliated, it's not framed as entertainment, it's framed as violence. And when she wins, it's not framed as fantasy, it's framed as earned. That tonal honesty makes it emotionally immersive. You don't watch from a comfortable distance, you get pulled in. And that immersion is enhanced by the show's consistent attention to sensory detail, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the cold air on exam mornings, the cramped bus rides, the rustle of papers, the taste of cheap food eaten too quickly, the silence of a library that feels like a sanctuary, the echo of expensive heels in a marble hallway that feels like a threat. These details build a lived world. They make you believe in Soo-yeon's life. And when you believe in her life, you feel every threat to it. I also want to talk about the title again, because as the series continues, Born to Win starts to sound less like a prophecy and more like a curse placed on Soo-yeon by other people's expectations. Once her lineage is known, at least to certain circles, people start projecting onto her. They expect her to want the company. They expect her to seek revenge. They expect her to be grateful. They expect her to be a symbol. And the show's subtle tragedy is that Soo-yeon never asked to be a symbol. She wants to be a student, a person, a daughter in the most basic sense. But because she exists at the intersection of class conflict and family scandal, the world insists on turning her into a headline. The series' emotional question, then, becomes, can she reclaim her personhood from the story being written around her? And that's where the show becomes quietly radical. It suggests that winning isn't just beating your rivals, it's refusing to be reduced. It's refusing to be consumed as content. It's insisting on being complex in a world that wants simple labels. That's why the best way to watch Pewaris Jenius is not as a who gets the inheritance puzzle but as a character study about what it takes to remain yourself while climbing out of a pit that other people keep insisting you should stay in. And if you're the kind of viewer who loves watching strategic protagonists, characters who think, plan, adapt, you'll find Soo-yeon immensely satisfying because her victories often come from foresight rather than luck. She anticipates how people will spin her story. She chooses her words carefully. She understands timing. She knows when to stay silent and when to speak. And the show respects the intelligence of its audience by letting you see those gears turning without over-explaining them. It trusts you to pick up on subtext. It trusts you to understand why a simple decision, like refusing a ride home from a powerful person, can be a massive act of self-protection. That trust makes the series feel sophisticated. At the same time, it never loses emotional accessibility. Even if you don't catch every political maneuver, you'll feel the emotional truth. You'll feel what it's like to be judged. You'll feel what it's like to carry a dream like a fragile object through a crowd that keeps bumping into you. You'll feel what it's like to be brilliant and still have to beg for basic respect. So if you're asking me whether the next part of this story is worth your time beyond the initial hook, the answer is yes, because the longer you stay with it, the more it reveals itself as a story not about wealth but about value. Not about inheritance but about identity, not about being chosen by a family but about choosing yourself, and by the time you're deep into the later episodes, you're no longer watching for the moment Soo-yeon gets recognized as an heir, you're watching for the moment she recognizes herself as someone who doesn't need permission to exist. And when that recognition starts to crystallize, the series becomes something you don't just binge, you carry it with you, you think about it when you're tired, when you're doubting yourself, when you're feeling small in a room full of people who seem effortlessly confident, and you remember Soo-yeon at her desk, under that lamp, turning effort into a future, and it's hard not to feel a strange kind of courage rise in your throat, not the loud, cinematic courage of punching a villain, but the quiet courage of sitting down again, of trying again, of doing the work even when nobody claps, because that is the real victory the series keeps honoring, and if you've ever lived any version of that, if you've ever had to be your own lifeline, then Pewaris Jenius Yang Terlahir Untuk Menang doesn't just entertain you, it understands you. And that understanding is why people keep talking about it, why scenes keep circulating, why the show feels like it arrived in 2026 exactly when audiences needed a story that says, without sugarcoating, you can be born into disadvantage and still be built for triumph, not because the world is fair, but because you are stubborn enough to demand a life anyway.